Welcome everybody, welcome back to our first seminar organized by the ERC project and research group Abstraction. This is the first seminar organized within the academic year 2024-25. And we are very glad, very happy today to host here a colleague who is also on the board of the ERC advisors, and is Professor Tony Veale, who is a professor at the School of Computer Science at the University College Dublin, UCD, in Ireland. And Tony has been, he's a researcher in many areas, in cognitive linguistics, computational linguistics, cognitive sciences, computer sciences, artificial intelligence, and so forth. And what I have always extremely admired in Tony's profile, is that he can talk to many different academic audiences and communicate and express and transfer meaning in a way to many different academic audiences, ranging from the humanities, the hard sciences, and so forth. And Tony has also been a bridge in a way between the academia and the industry, because he has been working in both the industry and the academia. He has developed text understanding and machine translation system for Hitachi, as well as natural language processing tools when he was working in Texas, the USA, and he patented web-based question answering technology. In academia, he is well known in many different communities for his work in computational creativity, first of all, analogical reasoning, and lexical analogies. So later this week, he will also talk more about analogies. And he is also a very popular researcher and scholar within the metaphor studies, within the community of people working on figurative language and irony and humor. And so the way, let me say this, the way we refer to Tony among friends and colleagues in metaphor studies is he's a man from the Renaissance, in a way. This is Christina. Namely, that he can do art in a way, as well as science, with both domains with the same rigor, scientific rigor as well as artistic rigor in a way. So he can communicate his output to so many different audiences that I find it amazing. He's the author of many books, articles, and software. My favorite, I think, is Exploding the Creativity Myth, the Computational Foundations of Linguistic Creativity, published in 2012. He's also the founder of the International Association for Computational Creativity. And Exploding the Creativity Myth, I think, is a groundbreaking book that sets the ground for this field, the computational foundations of creativity. But then he published also many other books. One of them is Metaphor Computational Perspective, to also read Shutova and the art of it, exactly, and other tools. But without any further ado, I will say that now I leave the word to Tony for his talk, his seminars today, which is titled, Are You Not Entertained? Building AI with Real Sense of Humor. And I remind to the audience that after the talk, we will process the video and then we will we'll publish it on the Abstraction website for those of you who did not have the opportunity to attend. So then you can share the information with colleagues who did not have the opportunity. So thank you very much.
Thanks for coming, guys, and thanks online for attending. I'm going to talk in somewhat general terms about humor, which of course is a huge, very expansive concept. and I don't want to be reductive, or I won't be forced to be a little reductive. There's no like humour in a single talk, and I want to talk about the computational treatment of humour. So one of my focal areas, or one of my joys in doing research. So in this talk, I will do a whistle-stop tour of families of humour theory, the whole bunch of competing theories. It's amazing to think that we still don't really agree on what humour is or what its function is, though it also seems intrinsic and essential to our lives as humans. From a computational point of view, I want to look at how we would represent the knowledge that goes into understanding and building a joke. I'm going to have a very narrow view of what a joke is. Obviously, there's a spectrum of humour from wit to irony and sarcasm through these formulaic jokes and narrative jokes. I would focus very narrowly on the setup and punchline variety of joke, while acknowledging that there's so much more humour. We try to get some statistical generalizations that we can exploit computationally, and then we'll try to get large language models to help us. So you might have noticed that large language models are wonderful, but they're not very funny. As one paper put it recently, they're fun but not funny. Okay, so the three main theories of humour, which have given birth to sub-branches and blended variations, are superiority, incongruity, and relief. What is superiority theory or superiority family of theories of humour? It has to do with this idea that in humour, we laugh at someone or something. We look down, we momentarily feel superior, and that superiority makes us joyful. And in the moment, in the context, when we feel superior, we express that joy with laughter. So, okay, it will survive. So Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher who was active in Britain around the time of Isaac Newton, the Great Fire and the Great Plague, which shaped his outlook and made him think that life was a misery. Brief is ugly and short, if you write life. He gives us this theory of superiority in humour where he says some glories after to make it these frivolous laughter and is caused either by some act of their own and pleases them or by the accusation of some deformed thing in another. We laugh at the deformity of others. It's a very cruel view of humour, isn't it? But it also echoes what Aristotle said. Aristotle wasn't a very funny guy. He wasn't making him laugh in the local tavern, but he was really describing humour as he saw it in the theatre, where playwrights would have a deformed person, and we see this in the Commedia dell'arte as well, and that the audience could achieve catharsis by laughing at someone who's less endowed or less capable of themselves. Obviously, superiority humour plays a part. It's a dimension of humour, but it's not the whole thing, thankfully, otherwise it wouldn't be worth talking about. Right. Here's an example of a joke from Serenissimo, which was then analysed by Freud, which was then analysed by Arthur Koestler in his book, The Act of Creation. So there's a king, a newly made king. He decided he's going to tour, like Prince Charles became king. So he's going to tour the kingdom and meet the hoi polloi, all of the masses of his kingdom. So he's going from town to town with his horse, with his entourage, and in the mob of dirty, poor people that are clamoring around him, he sees someone who looks exactly like him. The same big ears and weak chin and watery eyes and big forehead and sausage fingers. And looks exactly like me. So he reaches down from his horse and he says, "Hey, my good man, did your mother ever work in the royal palace?" And the dirty peasant says, "No, but my father did." So the king goes from being the king of everything to being a bastard. He falls off his high horse. So superiority humor can also be a case of seeing the mighty humbled. We use humor to puncture egos and to bring them down to our side. So there's something a bit more noble about that than laughing at the form. So there are two forms of superiority here: exulting in one's own power and laughing at power reversed. It's all about social dynamics. It's an interesting thing to try to capture in the computer, right? An interesting stuff branch of superiority theory comes from Henri Bergson, a French philosopher working in the early 20th century. He has a famous set of essays called Laughter or The Rire, essays on the meaning of the comic. He's French, he is a French philosopher. So he says things of tremendous generality, and he asserts them as being true in all cases, which of course is nonsense, but his ideas are so interesting. He said basically, we laugh every time a person gives us the impression of being a thing. So there is something to that. If you think about pratfalls and physical comedy, where people are falling over and getting hit by planks, slipping on banana peels, and doing all sorts of silly things as if they were dumb automata, we laugh. Of course, we have a tendency as human beings to treat others as things, and we don't laugh when we treat other people as things. So there's obviously a distinction to be made here. He makes a very interesting point. He says it's easier to laugh in a group. Comedy requires complicity. You see this, if you're at home and a clock falls off the wall, you go. But if there are other people, you might laugh when the clock falls. Perfect. Your armchair makes a funny sound when you sit on it. You're unlikely to laugh when you're alone. With your other people, you might find it hilarious. We laugh at bodies more than at minds. We laugh at repetition, at the unthinking, at malfunction. So if Barack Obama stumbles over a word, you can't find that funny because he's not supposed to. We don't really laugh anymore when Donald Trump stumbles over a word. I feel kind of sorry when Joe Biden forgets things. We don't laugh at Joe Biden. So, but basically, when people act with rigid machines and they lose their joie de vivre, that's where rigidity applies, and we become, in a moment, superior and we laugh. There's an interesting film, Charlie Chaplin. If you haven't seen it, I urge you to see it. It's called Modern Times. It's one of his best films from 1936, and it's based explicitly on the philosophy of Bergson. It's a critique of the modern world, which attempts to industrialize and to mechanize and to turn people into cogwheels in a larger machine. And in fact, there's a scene where Charlie, as a worker, is sent into a machine to repair it and swallowed up by the cogs. It's a very famous scene. He kind of worms his way through the cog. In fact, there's a character in the movie called Henry Bergson in the cafe. Chaplin is winking at the audience with a profound element in his framework. Bergson tells us that flexible vice may not be so easy to ridicule as a rigid virtue. So we don't laugh at people for their vices. People tend to be quite flexible in their vices. They're quite clever and justifying. And it's people with rigid virtues. We like to see people who are holier than thou fall off their heads. People who are too rigid to adapt, we find them well. But again, these are very high level ideas. Not much computational meat in them. Now, why do we laugh? I mean, laughter is a physical expression in which we shed physical energy. There's a sense in which there's a mental displacement that gets turned into this physical expression. You laugh to remove energy from the system, pent-up energy. There's a relief in humor and a release of emotions. It's cathartic. And this goes back to Aristotle. We saw humor as one of the forms of catharsis. Tragedy is another form, of course. And humor and tragedy are connected ideas. Lord Shaftesbury in the early 18th century, he wrote a definitive essay on what we call the relief and release theories of humor in The Freedom of Wit. And he saw humor as a way of raging against the machine, if you will, and freeing ourselves momentarily from the shackles of obligation and societal norms and expectations. And in modern times, humor theorists have turned to this aspect of humor to formulate theories. So the norm and violation, or the N+3 theory of Veitch in 1998, talks about humor as a violation of a norm. But not just any violation. If you murder someone, that's a violation of the norm. We don't really think that's funny. We don't expect someone to be acquitted if the lawyer makes the jury laugh. They don't really try to praise it or frame it as a humorous event. So it has to be somehow a benign violation or a non-serious violation, right? So the idea was developed further by McGraw and Warren. So McGraw and Caleb Warren in 2010 in the popular benign violation theory. So humor involves violation of a norm, but the violation has to be seen as benign. So hitting someone over the head with a brick and putting them into intensive care is not funny. Hitting them over the head with a rubber chicken, a bit funny, right? So there has to be a sense of threat, but the threat has to disappear. Humor is a safe place. Okay, so we have to get to this idea of how do we represent norms? How do we evaluate whether the violation of a norm is benign? And again, you might think these are all signatures of humor, but they're not really getting to the essence of humor. And this is the problem with humor theorizing generally, that we tend to take aspects of humor, which may well be contingent aspects, and to turn them into essentialist accounts in which all of humor is this. Now, it may well be that some humor thrives on the violation of norms in a benign way, but other humor is more superiority oriented, and other humor is more incongruity based. So I try to avoid essentialist accounts, and simply my philosophy is whatever works, whatever you're doing. And it's hard to come up with a joke that was an expression of the relief theory, but here's a joke that I heard again recently at a funeral, in fact. Marriage isn't a word, it's a sentence. Right? So people express themselves, they turn their personal grievances or woes into humor. And there's a relief and a release to it, right? Don't know how well the joke translates, but it's probably universal, right, for men and women. Okay, incongruity resolution. This is the big beast, the big boss of the world of humor theorizing. It was first written down as a theory by philosophers by James Beattie, a Scottish philosopher, but it was also developed as an idea by Blaise Pascal, by Immanuel Kant, by Arthur Schopenhauer. It's been very popular philosophically, right? And it was developed into a computational model in the 80s in a very, very influential model by Victor Raskin in his script switching account called the Semantic Script Theory of Humor, or the SSTH. And that account was essentially turned into a cognitive linguistic account in an isomorphic way by Sharon Poussin in her 2000 book on blending, where she offered this view of humor as frame shifting from one frame or framing device to the other. I'll explain exactly what I mean by that in a moment. But both of these accounts really are dressed-up versions of association, which Arthur Koestler proposed as a general mechanism of creativity in his Magisterium 1964 book, The Act of Creation, which is an amazing book. He's not a psychologist, he's not really an academic, it's more of a highly opinionated and respected reporter. And so he struggles with the terminology. He talks about mental matrices, what we would call frames or mental spaces. But basically, his idea is that humor occurs at the boundary of two conflicting frames of reference and calls for us to reconcile those frames of reference when we see the boundary friction between them. So in script switching, a situation seems to be governed by one familiar script, but then the joke evolves, punchline delivers a surprise that forces us to shift to a different script, and in frame shifting, you just replace script with frame, but you end up being allowed to use the terminology of benefits here. And in 1972, Jerry Soules proposed this two-stage process model, which is cognitively and psychologically interesting, and it makes certain empirical claims. For instance, that we understand a joke by gambling on one particular frame or script, and then we're forced to revise our assumptions, go back, reinterpret everything, and go forward again. So there's a time core to the joke. You get the punchline, you go, what? Oh, I misunderstood. And then you go back and go forward. So this idea has been around for a long time. If you saw this, the debate with Trump from Kamala Harris, Trump was asked, do you have a health plan? He said, I have concepts of a plan. Do you have a humorous theory? No, I have concepts of a humorous theory. And that's basically what people have, concepts of humorous theory. We really should have more. By the way, incongruity is interesting to all sorts of people. The surrealists in the early 20th century were obsessed with incongruity, and they sought it out in their pictures and in their art. And a guiding quote was by Andre Bregon, who said, he stole this line from someone else, which was very much in keeping with the surrealist approach. Art should be as beautiful as a chance meeting on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. What's he talking about? Basically, familiarity robs the world of its magic. We see things as their functions. We become rigid in our point of view. But if you start putting things into bizarre juxtapositions and you try to find sense in the bizarre juxtapositions, then you have to look at things and you make the familiar strange again. That's what poets try to do. They call it ostracization. It's what jokes do. They take familiar ideas and they show you the limits of common sense of dealing with them, and you have to come up with an evolved, richer point of view and look at things from a perspective. And that's what the surrealists are doing, it's what humorists do. There's a kind of connection between surrealism and humor. If you think about what Banksy does, for instance, basically he's a kind of a Turner Prize style artist doing political cartoons and repeatedly. He's working in this surreal area. He's also telling simplistic jokes at the same time. One idea that appealed to me was from a mathematician, John Allen Panos, a catastrophe theoretic perspective. Catastrophe theory is a branch of mathematics that studies continuity and discontinuity especially, and has found applications in many areas of science outside mathematics, morphogenesis in biology, for instance. If I take a piece of paper and this, I fold it and kink it to get a three-dimensional manifold like this, you see at the point of the kink there's a discontinuity. If you were a roller skating ant and you were going along a new line there, and you came to that discontinuity, you go, right? You would suddenly find there's nothing underneath you. The surface is discontinuous. And capacity theory is all about modeling discontinuities in different dimensions. So this is a very simple cost discontinuity in 3 dimensions. Take a 2-dimensional surface and bend it to get this cost. But basically, with a joke, there is the common sense, straight ahead interpretation of the joke, which leads you to this discontinuity. Like, what? I'm discombobulated. It doesn't make sense anymore. Whereas a careful planner who thinks carefully, treads slowly, will follow route B, the red route there. What happens to the person who follows route A, most of us, and we give ourselves over to humor. There's no point in being the person who sees the meaning of the joke immediately. You're just robbing yourself of the humor. You go along script A, you get to this continuity, you go up, you walk back, and then you find route B. And there's satisfaction to doing that. So a joke can be modeled in this way, if only we could figure out what the dimensions were. Of course, the dimensions would be more than 3 dimensions. So this is a very metaphorical perspective, but an interesting one. I like to think of the axes as being obviousness, confidence, and time. So we're very confident in the obvious interpretation offered by script A, but over time we find ourselves at an impasse and we have. So from a computational point of view, we can model incongruity as a friction between our knowledge representations. We have a representation of script 1 or script A, script B, and the more they overlap, then the more likely those scripts are to be confused for each other. But the more they differ, the bigger the shock we'll get when they are confused. So we have to somehow model these things computationally, and that's a knowledge representation problem, an AI representation problem. So incongruity gives us something to latch onto as computationalists. So here's an incongruity joke from the two-stage perspective. I took this from the Reddit data set. I had to spend a long time looking through the Reddit data set to find a joke that was funny, clean, non-racist, non-sexist. It takes about an hour to find each joke. There's so much non-joke, so much nonsense, so much hate, so much pettiness. Okay, the jokes that I was able to find, they're not great. Here's my illustration. My father has the heart of a lion and a ban from the local zoo. Okay, so we call my father has the heart of a lion the setup of the joke. It establishes the world of the joke and its internal logic. It creates the expectations that the joke will thrive on. And a ban from the local zoo we call the punchline. This is the part of the joke where those expectations are shattered, where we're presented with the incongruity that would force it to switch scripts. So the script that we initially cling to, heart of a lion, this is a metaphor. It's a cliche. It's a brave man. He's a tough man. He is a man among men, right? Like this Mexican wrestler. But in a ban from the local zoo, why the man amongst men, a tough man, be banned from the zoo? Well, because he really does have the heart of a lion in a jar under his bed. It's a dead lion. So you have to work all of this out. And you shift from your metaphorical interpretation of the heart of a lion to your literal interpretation. So that's quite a loose interpretation of script, right? Metaphor versus literal reading script. So when I say script, even though we often think of them as cinematic scripts, we have to think of them as meaning representations and strategies for building meaning representation, which means that those scripts can get in any. Let me give you an example of how small the crevices are. There was this famous actress, she was the Paris Hilton of her day. She was famous for being famous. Zaza Gabor. She was a Hungarian serial wife who moved to America. Her sister, Eva Gabor, was on TV in a TV show called Green Acres. But Zaza was famous for having husbands and divorcing them and having husbands and divorcing. And having a thick Hungarian accent and covered in furs. And she was being interviewed by a reporter who was less than charmed with her. And she was there in her furs and her diamonds and so forth. He said, "You're not exactly the typical housekeeper of a wife, are you?" She said, "Darling, you don't have any idea. I am a wonderful housekeeper. Every time I divorce a man, I keep the house." Right? So even the interpretation of the word housekeeper is open to script reversal, right? Okay, here's an example of a joke, also from Reddit, where the incongruity is not between the setup and the punchline, but it's entirely within the punchline. The setup is merely creating conditions. Well, I bought a new thesaurus, but it's nothing to write house about. Okay, so here we need to understand that there's an English idiom, nothing to write home about, which means nothing special. This is such a poor thesaurus. The best we can do is we can say house and home kind of thing. So I kind of like this one, but we can see that the two scripts are the idiom, nothing to write home about, and the modified idiom, which breaks the idiom, nothing to write house about. And the nothing to write house about variant is motivated by the fact that we're talking about a thesaurus. So both of the scripts are in the punchline. They're not in the setup and the punchline. So the scripts can be located in different places. So it's quite a flexible theory. It's a polite way of putting it, right? And this doesn't involve the two-stage reinterpretation of source. Okay, so we've got relief of superiority and incongruity. And throughout history, we've had scholars spending all of their money on one of these theories for systems. But in fact, if you think about your favorite jokes, or maybe even some of your least favorite jokes, they all involve a degree of incongruity. They all involve a degree of superiority. You're laughing at something or at someone, even if it's just an idea. And there's a relief or a release that comes with laughing. So it's wrong to say that two of these theories are incorrect and one is correct. They're all correct to varying degrees in different times. So the dimensions of humour. And we see that these same dimensions occur in other things, such as prank in magic tricks, for instance. You've got the build-up and what's called the prestige. All of the stages of the magic trick correspond to the stages of the joke. And we laugh, we're surprised, we're stunned, we laugh at our ignorance. Except that we don't figure out how the joke, we don't figure out how the trick works. And when we do, we're quite disappointed. Now, it's also the case that as the joke unfolds in a relatively long narrative joke, this balance of relief and congruity and superiority can shift over time. Which makes time a hugely important dimension of jokes. If you fumble a joke, if you delay too long, if you pause too long before the punchline, or if you don't pause at all, you can ruin the joke. For really funny jokes, I have a habit of laughing before I deliver the punchline, which ruins the joke. But it stretches it out. So you have the professionals, they get the big money from a reason, right? They're very good with their natural timing. And the timing view is borne out by ERP studies, so-called event-related potential studies of human subjects, where we look at brain activities. So typically, 400 milliseconds after the onset of the incongruous stimulus, there's a spike in mental processing. And in an ERP graph, the negative is shown above the positive. So we see that as a peak rather than a trough. And it turns out that this is quite a reliable indicator of incongruity, and then the brain having to deal with incongruity. Now, that peak is much bigger when the stimulus is genuinely incongruous as opposed to entirely incongruent. We'll see that in a little bit later. But we can get to the peak even for non-humorous cases. I can't find my car keys, or you've mispronounced a word, or you've said something I don't understand. We still get that peak. Doesn't mean that it's a joke or a result of laughter, but it is an indicator of the incongruity that we're trying to stimulate. Here's a joke which won the best joke at the 2012 Edinburgh Fringe Festival. I've expressed it visually with Stephen Hawking. Obviously, he wasn't at the 2012 festival, as far as I know. He was on The Simpsons, and he had a very dry sense of humor. Okay, so the joke is this: I was raised as an only child, which really pissed off my sister. So you can see the two scripts there. Can anyone tell me what the two scripts are? Well, there's the only child script. And what's the competing script?
Just see this steps on not being an only child.
Yeah, so one script is the only child, and the other script is being a favorite child. So if we were to look at the knowledge representation needed to figure this out, what do we know, and what does the computer need to know to do this joke? Let's look at it like. I was raised as. Now, the joke, surprisingly, hinges on a very invisible word, the word as. I was raised as an only child. And as has two meanings in this case. As equals like. It was as if the earth shook, right? It was as if, as in a sympathy, right? He was tall as a silverback gorilla, as equals like, or as equals is. I was raised as an only child because maybe I'm an only child, right? And we have to determine the meaning of as. So it's a tiny little word and it goes unnoticed. It's a function word, essentially. So there's the as equals is, which means I am an only child, which means I have no siblings. Okay, which contradicts the idea of having siblings. So mention of my sister now contradicts the idea that I have no siblings, which means I have to resort to script B as equals like. I was raised like an only child, and my siblings didn't like that. Okay. Now, why is the joke funny? Do we marvel at the author's use of the word as? It's a really clever use of the word as. We don't. Obviously, the author has to use the word as in this clever way, but I think most of us understand the joke without ever thinking about the word as in this function. We get humor out of the sense that the sister is really pissed off, right? There's a form of superiority humor there. We're kind of laughing at this person feeling jealous. So you can see there's superiority humor here. There's also script switching. And there's a kind of a relief as well, because there's a relief to see that other people have these feelings too, that we're not alone. So all of the theories come together, but the key one, the driving force, is the incongruity theory. And the incongruity occurs in this nondescript word that we're not even aware of, right? And the computer has to somehow make sense of this. So where do we get our scripts from? We humans get our scripts from living in the world, being active agents and interacting with each other. We get our scripts vicariously by watching TV and reading books, getting them secondhand and third hand. And we see other people, we hear their stories about the world. So we get them from all sorts of places and we imbibe them copiously and we store them away. Where does a computer get them? A computer doesn't live a life, it has no life, doesn't go shopping, it has no needs. But we train them on vast amounts of data that was generated by people with needs and with lives, and they vicariously have those lives. So LLMs acquire scripts from the data that humans leave behind on the web that describes their scripts and their circumstances. So we would expect LLMs to have a great many scripts, as many scripts as we do, if it's trained on the entirety of the web. Close to, right? I'm going to give you a challenge now. In class homework, here is a normative setting, a non-funny scenario that you probably recognize as something that happens in the world quite a bit. A pair of rough fellows walks into a bar. They look like trouble. We've all seen this, right? The barman takes one look at them and says, I'll serve you, don't start anything. Right? But we know what start means here. It doesn't mean don't start a game of Monopoly, because that game never ends, right? Don't start a talk set, if you're only here for a couple of drinks. Don't start means don't start trouble, right? Okay, so your little exercise is to change, make a minimal change, a minimal edit to either the setup or the response that turns this into a joke. And as a hint, I've marked in yellow the words that you might try attacking first. I like to think of humor as a mental hack, essentially hacking other people's brains in real time.
So non-native speakers might be.
You're getting into their heads and you're changing the way they think, or you're exploiting the way you believe they think, and you're getting around your normal security devices. You're smuggling ideas past the sense. So what would you change it to? This is a tough challenge, right? There's a reason that People get paid telling jokes for their money. Would you change rock fellows? Would you change start?
If you had something, okay, this doesn't work, but as a first idea, if you had something like, instead of rough fellows, like football hooligans, and then maybe you could work it and kick off as start something.
Okay, look, be a pun.
To relate it to your.
Lots of these jokes are puns. Actually, a lot of jokes on Reddit are puns. Yeah, so what you want is to change rough fellows into something that starts has more of a connection. Right? So there's no strong connection between the idea of being rough and being tough and troublesome and the idea of start. So the joke on Reddit, yeah, this is one of the clean jokes that takes a long time to find, is this. A pair of jumper cables walked into a bar. Jumper cables, you hook them up to your car batteries and they won't start. The jumper cables are designed to start your car.
Yeah.
A pair of jumper cables works. How absurd is that?
Yeah.
And jokes are often absurd, right? So, a roughly cut throat walks into a bar and says, "Do you have any Guinness?" And the barman says, "Afraid not. Afraid not." Careful joke. Or a skeleton walks into a bar and says, "I'll have 2 beers and a mop." There's a wine, there's a mop, but if we can't hold this beer. So jokes, they take us into the realm of the stupid, the absurd. That's where incongruity comes in. And in the realm of the absurd, incongruity can still be meaningful. We get meaning, sense from nonsense. That's what jokes allow us to do. They allow us to make sense of the world, even when the world isn't cooperating with us, which makes it a very valuable skill to have in navigating a changing environment. Now, the incongruity can't simply be strange for its own sake. The humor theorist Elliot Oren, who's a folklorist by training, he calls it appropriate incongruity. So there's a weirdness to the joke, but it's all connected. It's all thematically sensible. Right? So we see the connection between jumper cables and stars. So the incongruity is appropriate. People have different terminologies for this. Salvatore Torre refers to relevant inappropriateness, or if you will, relevant irrelevance. It's all very contradictory. Every humor theory can really be summarized in 2 words, and the words somehow imply the opposite of each other. It really gets back to the idea that they're all based on income. Rafael Giora, a brilliant psychoanalyst who does an amazing empirical work in validating and testing various hypotheses, she refers to this as optimal innovation. The idea that we find something optimally satisfying, we find novelty optimally satisfying when it mixes the familiar with the novel. Something that's too novel, it's just discombobulating, like a weird art house film. What the hell was I watching? Whereas if you go to see Michael Bay's Transformers Hard into Pieces, there's no novelty. You go, what the hell was I watching? What you want is something in the middle, where there's enough familiarity to brand the novelty and enough novelty to be stimulating and interesting. That's a tough, and that goes back to the Wundt curve from the 19th century, where you map hedonism versus familiarity, and we want a middle ground, a sweet spot between the very familiar, the contemptuously familiar, and the confusingly novel. So a language model seems to capture this idea because it's all about capturing norms. It learns from copious amounts of text what the norms in language are. If I say to you, the dentist was grumpy because he had a bad day at the, well, the most obvious conclusion to that sentence is the word office. Bad day at the office. Office is the most high probability ending for that phrase. You don't say he had a bad day at the cinema. What the hell is he doing at the cinema? Right? Bad day at the church. What was he doing at church? No, he was at the office. Dentists work in offices. Besides which, the phrase "bad day at the office" is extremely common. It's why people in the 60s come home and drink 2 martinis, right? Have a bad day at the office. We don't do that anymore. We work the pub anymore. Now, the joke here is the dentist was grumpy because he had a bad day at the orifice. Orifice is an interesting word in English. It comes from the Latin, so I guess you have a similar word in Italian, right? In English, it has a kind of naughty meaning as well, because it means an opening, but typically it means an opening in the human body. Right? Now, of course, the dentist spends his or her life with their hands in someone's mouth. Strange occupation, isn't it? Children, I want to be a dentist. I don't spend all day with my hand in someone else's mouth. So they're in there, in the orifice. And there are other orifices that Freud would have written about. So we take this word and we're kind of cheeky, oh yeah, orifice. And it rhymes with office. So we're expecting office, we get orifice. Orifice is appropriately incongruous because it matches dentist. Right? The accountant is grumpy because he had a bad day, the orifice doesn't work, the dentist works. So we have 2 aspects of the joke here. One is that we're expecting office, and the language model will tell us that the probability of seeing office in that last position is very high, and the probability of seeing what we actually do see, orifice, is near 0. So that's one aspect of the joke. Now the second aspect is, can we make orifice relevant? And there's a semantic similarity between dentist and orifice that makes it relevant. So we do a substitution that is, in a sense, recoverable. Puns are all about recoverability. You have to create an incongruity that makes people want to recover an original meaning, and you have to make that original meaning recoverable. And language models do that, allow us to model these things quite well. So pun detection, for instance, uses statistical models like this. So we did quite well at using idiomatic probabilities. Okay, so we looked up n-grams, and by the way, an n-gram is a sequence of n contiguous tokens in a text. And there's a very famous database of web n-grams called Google 1 terabyte n-gram database. It was released in 2006, and it's a snapshot of their index. And it has n-grams for n equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So these are the 5 grams that begin bad day at D. And we can see that office, there were 5,403 instances of that phrase ending in office. The next most popular was beach. Someone had a bad day at the beach, someone kicked sand in their face. 241. Bad day at the races. That makes sense, right? Lose all your money by betting on the wrong horse or on a mangy dog. Bad day at the theatre. Maybe it's a terrible play. Maybe you were Abraham Lincoln and you chose the wrong play, right? Bad day at the range, as opposed to shooting range. So we can see that if you were to look at n-grams, you get the probabilities that you need. But n-grams are very, very sparse and they're discrete. And n needs to be very long to take account of the context. And what neural language models do is they use a very large n, and they generalize and interpolate between the observed n-grams to amount of n-grams that aren't seen. Because the larger n gets, the sparser the data set. So neural language models have replaced the n-gram models that we used to use 20 years ago, and they do so by generalizing. So do LLMs, can they explain jokes? Here's another Reddit joke that I quite like this because I wrote it down space note. So the joke is, what did Buzz Aldrin say when he was made Supreme Dictator of NASA? Kneel before me. Right, so, you know your history. Buzz was the second man on the moon. Actually, he was incredibly torn up about being the second man on the moon. He was desperately campaigning to be the first, but Armstrong was the very first. He had such aplomb. He was unperturbable. So Buzz was the second man. And if you look at the photos of the first moon landing, there are no photos of Neil Armstrong. This character was so bitter, he couldn't take any. But Neil is going, Buzz, take a picture. And Buzz is going, no, it's a rock. I need to pause. So the only picture we have of Neil in the moon is in the reflection in Buzz Aldrin's eyes. He put it right back. So he made supreme dictator of NASA, which is an interesting idea, that the leader of NASA was a supreme dictator instead of being a bureaucrat. And what does he say? Kneel before me. So there's kind of an appropriate incongruity to him saying that. So it gets that the joke is playing words in reference to Buzz Aldrin and the American astronaut, who was the second person to walk with him. Okay, so we asked it to explain. And it tells us that Neil before me is a common expression used by powerful rulers to command obedience and submission. I think this is one of those cliches that everyone believes is true, but I don't know that dictators go around saying Neil before me. Right? So it's entirely compatible with our views that they implement. And of course, Neil sounds like Neil Armstrong, so it gets the sound similarity. How is it able to do this? Because it's learned to play language games. It's learned to talk like a human being. And one of the things that we as human beings do is that we explain jokes to each other. So it's learned to talk like someone playing the game of explaining the joke. And if you were to play that game well, you actually have to explain the joke. I don't know that it gets the joke, but it talks like it gets the joke. And what it says actually is an expression of the meaning of the joke, which for all intents and purposes as a computation is enough. So it turns out that these models are really good at explaining jokes and kind of poor at generating well-crafted comedian-style jokes. They have these meretricious attempts at humor that you see humans making at the water cooler, right? It's not funny, but I'm going to laugh anyway because it would be impolite not to. And it's got that awful, look at me, I'm telling a joke aspect to it, and it's not funny. But it's really good at analyzing jokes. And I think people tend to overlook this. LLMs are great for analysis. People see them as generative. But critiquing analysis is a form of generation too. And they're really good at it. So here's a classic joke that a language model might help us with. Okay, it starts 7 with Grandpa died peacefully in his sleep. And I visualize this here with Grandpa dying peacefully in his sleep. Right? I've got to nudge you along the path here as well. If I say Grandpa died peacefully in his sleep, how do you imagine it? You imagine him at home in bed, right? Doesn't wake up in the morning. Well, we all want to go eventually. Okay. Because that visualization contains a great deal more information than you've actually been given in the set. The human imagination adds and accumulates unlearned information from cliches and from experience in words. And it's the job of the punchline to make you pay for those assumptions. So what is the punchline? This is a really old joke, by the way. Grandpa died peacefully in his sleep. Unlike his passengers who died screaming. Right? So now we realize he didn't die in bed, he died behind the wheel of a school bus. And adding on the pathos, maybe it's a bus full of old people going to an outing or to a tea dance or something. You know, they're full of joy and optimism, and Grandpa has a heart attack, and the bus goes off a cliff, and they go. That's really important, actually. Somehow we have to imagine them suffering. We have to imagine them screaming. If it all happened like this, and they were all dead on the bus before they realized what had happened, there would be no humor here. We are sadists. We have to imagine that they go, what? The bus is out of control. Someone wake him. He's not waking up. there's a sign saying, "Take this clip my head," and everyone's shouting, "No!" And the bus goes off the cliff, right? And in slow motion, why did we pick him as our driver? That has to be the last thought that goes through your head. It doesn't work as a joke otherwise. This is theory of mind. You have to be able to put yourself in the position of the people on the bus. You're experiencing what they're experiencing, but you're doing it in a safe way. Jokes are safe. Like roller coasters, right? So there's a violation going on here. If there's a violation, you can laugh when people dying on the bus, right? But we laugh because they're not really dying on the bus. But we have to momentarily put ourselves into that position. Okay, so one of the things that we have to do when we're generating jokes or understanding jokes is understand what the unearned assumptions are. What are the assumptions that we're bringing to the table that aren't actually supported by the text? And can those assumptions be subverted and used against us? And if you look at guidebooks, standard comedy, for instance, one by Greg Dean, Step by Step Standard Comedy, he tells you to do exactly that. To create a familiar setup, identify the assumptions that follow, but which are not directly supported by the setup, and then try to subvert those assumptions. Notice the A and B here again. And in fact, we can see that John Allen Powell's catastrophe theoretic model and Greg Dean's branching model as being very similar. The standard comedian has a two-dimensional model, and the mathematician has a three-dimensional model, but if you look at them from the side, it's the same model. Which I find very satisfying, that the comedian and the mathematician look at the same phenomenon and essentially come up with the same understanding. But the problem is, and of course, the gap between A and B, the emotional gap, we have to measure both the conceptual distance and the emotional gap, is key to the humor. If nothing happens to the people on the bus, then there's no emotional gap. And we have to also blame the bus driver, Grandpa. At the beginning, Grandpa is a sweet old man, and we feel sorry for him because he died in his sleep. At the end of the joke, say, "Master, he shouldn't have been driving that bus," right? Notice also that Grandpa could die in his sleep in his own bed. And it's the replacement driver who took Grandpa's regular customers who had a heart attack. But if we make that assumption, there's no one to blame. We can't blame Grandpa. So it's by blaming Grandpa and directing this urge that we have to blame people that makes the joke funny. There's an emotional resonance and shape to the joke that we have. Can I almost do that? Okay, so let's start looking at these jokes on Reddit. So first thing we need to do is we expect that there has to be a gap between the two scripts A and B, and we don't know what the scripts are, we don't have a handle on them. But we can model this perhaps by saying there has to be some kind of gap between the setup and the punchline. The setup is really rooted in script A, and the punchline forces us on script B. So if we were to get to say the vector space cosine similarity between the setup and punchline, there should be some distance between them. And that distance would be greater than between a non-joke. So let's take 1,000 non-jokes. Here we take Wiki Q&A, that's like a question and answer resource, and we take 1,000 short questions, and we take first sentence of the first answer, and we take that as the setup and the punchline of a non-joke. And we get the cosine similarity between the setup and the punchline in this high-dimensional space created by a language model. The vector space we're dealing with is the A2 vector space, which is offered by OpenAI. It's based on a transformer, and it maps everything into 1536 dimensional space. And we see that the average or the mean cosine similarity between the setup and the answer is 0.79, and the range is from 0.66 up to 0.92. Right. Now, if we were to start jumbling the questions and the answers, so that the answer was to a question that wasn't asked, they're completely irrelevant, in other words. What would the cosine similarity distribution look like? And that's what we see in red here. 0.68 would be the mean, ranging from 0.6 to 0.77. So these are dysfunctional questions. This is where someone answers the wrong question, which means there's no connection. There's a complete switch of script. And we can see that if you look at the standard deviations, I think greater than 2 standard deviations between these two scenarios, right? Which means that we can discern these two sets of phenomena as belonging to different populations. They are discernible. There is a distinction in vector space terms between a sincerely answered question and a completely wrong-headed answer. Where would you expect jokes to lie on the spectrum? You expect jokes are somehow dysfunctional, aren't they? You create a setup and the punchline is connected to the setup, but it's not a natural connection. So it should have something more to do with the non-answer than the legitimate answer. That's what we found. We looked at riddle jokes. So what we did is we took like 90,000 jokes from the Reddit list, and we filtered all of the ones where the setup is a short question, has to end a question mark, and it has to be relatively short. And the response, the punchline, is an answer to the question, and again, it's a single sentence. And we call those riddle jokes. So we can compare them to the QA data. So when we looked at the semantic similarity between the sentence and punchlines and how that's distributed, you see that the mean semantic similarity is 0.77, ranging from 0.7 to 0.9. And then when we start randomly shuffling the jokes so that the punchline gets matched to the wrong setup, that's a completely bizarre scenario, then we get a 0.72 mean. And these aren't separable populations, right? The significance of the difference between the two means is much, much less. This means to me that jokes, these riddles, they're suspicious questions. They're not legitimate question answer pairs, but the illegitimacy of them is not so discernible statistic. That they're dressed up like legitimate answers to legitimate questions, but there's something defective about them. But that defectiveness isn't so broad and obvious that we can discern it statistically. These jokes are hiding in plain sight, so to speak. So what if we were to take the jokes and try to fine-tune the language model? So we fine-tuned GPT 3.5. At the time, it was the largest of the GPT models that was open to fine-tuning. You can now fine-tune GPT 4. And we took 6,000 jokes that we filtered as riddle jokes, and we also filtered them to be clean, non-sexist, non-homophobic, non-racist. That wasn't really entirely successful filtering, because lots of offense is not in the actual words, it's in the intent. And the moderation functionality can only see the words, cannot really see the intent. Here's an example of a riddle joke. I don't think you can read from the screen, but who is this Orshak guy? And why does he paint all of these pictures of my parents fighting? So you need to know what an Orshak blot is. It's that black and white smudge that psychiatrists give to patients. What do you see? And what you see is meant to be revealing in your psyche. So there's a kind of, again, the theory of mind, we imagine ourselves being this guy who doesn't know where water that blind is and doesn't realize that what he's looking at is just a random blind. Okay. So what fine tuning does with a language model is it gives the model extra data. And then it fine tunes or adapts some of the parameters of the model, but not all of them, so that it focuses its energy and attentions on the representative data that you give it in the fine tuning. So you're not retraining the model, you're just giving it a boost in a certain area of linguistic expertise. So here are the kinds of outputs we get when we fine tune the model. Why does a customer service representative cross the road to talk to his manager? I like this joke because they're always telling you, I need to talk to my manager. Now, it turns out that these language models are obsessed with jokes about crossing the road because the internet is obsessed with cats and chickens crossing the road. And if you try to get these things to generate jokes, they will give you the same joke over and over again. It's just a telling you a joke. Why did the tomato blush? Because it sold a salad dressing. We'll get that joke over and over and over again. So the way to get the language model to tell you a joke is not to tell you a joke. You have to provide a setup or get it to generate a setup from a topic and then get it to give you a punchline. So here, focus management, that's pretty good. And we ranked 11% of jokes belonging to that. Pretty good. You know, I'm not ashamed of that joke. Yes. And then 31% were just non-jokes. They were full of incongruity, but they had no appropriateness. How do you know if you find a bad Elvis impersonator? Break his legs and see if he sings. It doesn't make any sense. The incongruous is not appropriate. The appropriate is really important. How does Tony Veale make his toast? On the dark side, it's pretty good. Turns out the joke is already in training. 10%. Why did the basketball player refuse to eat seafood? Because he was afraid of the net. That's just incoherent. And then a really interesting class of jokes produced by the language model we call sincere jokes or sincere non-jokes. What did the robber say to the convenience store cashier? Give me all the money. I'm robbing the store. Okay, that's okay. But it's not funny. You missed the point of the punchline. The punchline is meant to take the conversation in a new direction. This is the same direction. So 19% of the jokes are non-jokes. They're simply sincere continuations. So only 1 in 10 is something like a joke. Another way of getting jokes is done particularly by a chap called Joe Toplin, who used to be a writer for Jay Leno, Dave Letterman. And he did some writing for the TV show Monk as well. Very funny guy. He's very talented as a comedian. He's written a book on how to be a comedian. It's one of his how-to books. These books are very interesting, but they don't help you to be funny. Because there's always step 3, be funny. That's it. My second book on this other step 3. Okay, so they tell you the trappings of humor, but again, they can't inspire you or make you inspire. And so this is a technique called chain of thought, which language models are great good at, and which the new version of GPT 4.01, which is based on a model they call Strawberry, does very, very well to solve math and logic problems. Better than a human. So you give it a prompt like this. This is actually a complete prompt. And the prompt looks like a set of instructions exactly for that reason. You are professionally joke writing for comedian to write a joke about topic X, follow these steps. Identify 3 offbeat associations of X that we all know. Identify surprising link between association in step 1 and X. Turn the links in step 2 onto joke setups without revealing surprise. Turn surprise and effect the reach link in step 3 into a snappy punchline. Select the least predictable punchline from step 4. Assemble a joke by pairing step and punchline. We've actually given it a computer program. That's another thing we can do with language models, so that we can use them as natural language programming languages. But you have to be very precise. The number of steps, we've used variables. So the language model, GPT 3.5 or GPT 4 will go, yes, that seems like a very good way to generate jokes. And we say, okay, now use this technique to generate a joke about politics. And then it will go through the steps. It will tell you what it calculates at each step. And then it will come up with a joke at the end that will not make you laugh. This is joking by committee, right? I mean, it's a very clear articulation. I never laugh at the jokes it produces. So we asked the language model to come up with a good topic for a joke, and then came up with awkward first dates. But then we gave it the chain of thought prompt and said, apply this sequence of steps to the topic of awkward first dates. And it suggested uncomfortable silences, picking a date spot, and overthinking the first greeting as being the 3 offbeat associations of. And then the surprising link was mental gymnastics. You're overthinking things, right? Crickets chirping. This is a cliche, right? You hear crickets. It means that there's no conversation. They're both nervous. And solving a Rubik's Cube. You're going through all of the steps. How should I do this? I want to appear cool, but not too cool. I want to appear sincere, but not too uptight. And then the snappy punchline isn't snappy. Okay. Turning a handshake into mental gymnastics routine should be an Olympic sport. Ever notice how overthinking greetings on the first day is like preparing for a diplomatic summit? These are not funny, right? They're meretricious. I'm doing what you asked me to do, and I will never ever be paid to be fine, right? It's really hard to actually tell it what to do and to get it to be fresh and original and snappy. So this is the kind of thing that these professional joke writers have been using elements. And I've appeared on a few radio shows and interviews with these people, and the hosts are generally quite upbeat. That's very good. And besides, this isn't really any better than what a language model would do without this setting anyway. Okay. So we get all sorts of stuff. See if I miss this slide. Here are some of the better jokes that we found using the COT. I was at a funeral when a telemarketer called me. Compliments for the whole family. That's not so bad, right? Selfie culture is getting out of hand. Avocado toast, the new traffic jam. No. Did you hear about the burger that got a speeding ticket? It was fast food. Well, that turns out to be in the training data. Now, there's no training data for the COT approach, but it's already on the web, which means it's in the training data blind form. My co-workers are so lazy, they're always on break records. You don't even know what that means. That's incoherent. I have a terrible roommate, but the rent is cheap. It's another example of sincere continuations that are non-jokes. So a very simple thing to do is look at the Reddit data. We looked at the Reddit data and we saw that the mean setup was 47 characters long, and the standard deviation is 15 characters. So we said, okay, we're going to prove the jokes generated by the system if the setup is longer than 60 characters, the mean plus 1 standard deviation. It's too long and we're throwing them away. Now, but notice the punchline, the mean is 27 characters. The punchline is snappy. it's shorter than the setup. If the punchline is longer than the setup, the joke is unbalanced. And if the punchline is too long, then it's not punchy. So we throw away jokes where the punchline is longer than the setup, or where the punchline is bigger than 45 characters. That's a very simple post-generation filtering. We throw away the things that don't look like jokes in the hope that what's left over is more joke. And we prompt the model with one fixed exemplar or two of the three near it. So the one fixed exemplar that we use is we tell it a joke. We say, why do politicians take laxatives? So they can speak more fluently. That's a good joke. We're trying to get at the joke, but this is what a joke is. Now you tell me a joke. Or if we have the setup generated by the language model, we retrieve the two nearest jokes in the Reddit data set and present them as examples. And then say, now you tell me a joke for the setup. And we filter them based on these criteria. We get some interesting results. So we get more acceptable jokes, almost 20%. I like this one a lot. What do you call a group of conspiracy theorists? A cover. I'm looking for this on the web. I had to make sure it wasn't in training data. And I found a website for a cover band where they accidentally called it a cover band. And so what the language model is doing is it's finding these linguistic accidents and it's repurposing them. So they've often been called statistic or stochastic parrots, but they're really stochastic magpies. They can repurpose things. How do you make the bad driver nervous? With a steering wheel, it's a normal joke because you can see it's trying to be a joke, but it doesn't work. What do the oceans say to the shore? Nothing, it just waves. That's actually a familiar joke. We get 11% of those. Why did the soda, very American term soda, why did the soda go to the doctor? Because it had too many problems. It's plain incoherent, right? And why did the subway train smell bad? Because it had too many commuters. That's just sincere. But we see that we've doubled the number of acceptable jokes by pruning the average. Now, finish with this slide. We've also been looking at GPT-4. We'll have to look at GPT-5, I guess. So we looked at 5 different approaches. One-shot priming, that's where we tell it a joke, the politician and laxative joke. We get it to generate a setup and then ask it to generate a punchline instead. We look at the number of new jokes. We do sampling, which is where we get it to generate a joke and we sample the outputs to filter out things that are too long or unbalanced. We do fine tuning, where we give it 6,000 jokes in the Reddit set in the hope that will make it funnier. We use RAG, retrieval augmented generation, where we retrieve the two nearest jokes to the setup, give it to the language models examples, and then ask it to give us a punchline. And chain of thought, which is the algorithm expressed as a prompt that Joe Topman uses. We look at those 5 techniques for GPT 3.5 turbo and GPT 4 turbo. And we got mixed results about the LLM size. GPT 4 is about 8 times bigger than GPT 3.5 in terms of its parameters. We're talking about the difference between 220 billion parameters and 1.76 trillion. GPT 4 is a mixture of experts model. It's quite complicated and they're quite secretive about its architecture, but it's big. It's much, much bigger. And we see that with simple one-shot priming, it does better on the new jokes. It does slightly better on the sampling. But sampling plus RAG does better than 3.5. GPT-4 gives us a few more familiar jokes. Right. So for sampling and RAG, it gives us 30% of its output on existing jokes. If you wanted to invent jokes, that's bad. If you just want to tell jokes, it's good. Incoherence, we see mixed results. But generally, we don't see a great deal of evidence to make paying for GPT-4, to make paying for the larger model worthwhile. You should be able to do more with less. So it's all about how you prompt and how you filter. It's not a question of, will the model get funnier as it gets bigger? I don't think it will. The model will get funnier if you use it the right way. And it's all about how you prompt it, and importantly, what you throw away. Because I think if you think about it, whenever you try to be funny, we all try to be funny occasionally, there's things that you explicitly hold back. I'm not saying that, I'm not touching that, I'm not going there. They won't understand this, it will be misunderstood, I'll be in trouble, I'll be cancelled, I'm not saying that. So we have this mental filter, and we need to get mental filters on the language models. Well, not because the joke is necessarily excellent, because it's a not a joke. If we do that, we can do a lot with less. Okay, I probably really sorry, but let me leave it there. Hopefully, we have a few minutes questions.
Nice. Okay. There are
Anyone left on the Zoom?
absolutely. Yes, if there are questions from here or from home. But so many inputs and ideas. I was taking notes, and I have been thinking of questions which then you answer in the rest of your question. But one of the things that came to my mind is that, of course, there are different types of incongruity that make a joke, as you explained, and some incongruities seem to be simpler than others. Some of them seem to be more language-based, more co-occurrence-based, or more easily detectable with co-occurrences of words in text, like the jumper cables in a bar, and then the start verb. Others seem to be more complex to detect based only on linguistic occurrences, like the skeleton in a bar that orders a mop to clean up because it goes through the bones. So I think that type of incongruity requires a deeper processing in the human mind and possibly a simulation of the situation. So the integration of extra linguistic information. I was wondering whether you think that all jokes can be eventually understood by, for instance, language models that are based only on text, or whether language models would need to integrate with multimodal information.
Maybe I'll answer that one first.
Yeah.
I think certainly there are jokes that rely on visual information, and GPT-4 can accept visual input. And in fact, in the GPT-4 scorecard document that was released by OpenAI, it's got a 100-page document. They have an example of GPT-4 being presented with a picture of a smartphone, and someone has connected an Ethernet, not an Ethernet cable, but an old-fashioned VGA cable. So what's happening in this picture? And it correctly diagnoses the absurdity of putting a VGA cable into a smartphone. So it's able to parse the image and identify the incongruity. It's incredibly promising. And I think this speaks to the idea that these models are really good at analysis, not so good at taking analysis and then reapplying it. And I think we're all the same, right? We identify similarities between jokes. We can't take the essence of that similarity and apply it. So I'll give you an example. It's a very famous joke by the comedian Bob. Monkhouse that was reused in the film Joker with Joaquin Phoenix. So Monkhouse used to say, when I was a kid, I told everyone I wanted to be a comedian when I grew up, and they all laughed. Well, now I'm a comedian, damn it, and they're not laughing now. Right? There's an incongruity there, and we see through theory of mind that this guy isn't seeing himself the way the world is. There's a dramatic irony in it. There's a comedian called Tim Minchin. He's a singer-songwriter. He sings funny songs. His stage act is full of singing and fooling around and very clever wordplay and so forth. And there's another comedian, Jimmy Carr, somewhat controversial comedian, and he laughs like a donkey. And he went to Tim Minchin's show, and he was sitting by the show going like a donkey. And he was laughing so loudly that he interrupted the show. And Tim Minchin said, "Hey, Jimmy, keep quiet, will you? I don't go to your show and laugh my head off." So there's something similar here. Both of those jokes work in the same way. The idea of laughter as approval and the lack of laughter as a form of respect. And are fundamentally at odds with each other. We see that idea work its way out. But if I now say to you, take that conceit, that laughter can mean two things: a lack of respect or respect for a comedian, and generate a third joke. I don't think any of us can do it right. But I give you the blueprint, and you still can't do it. So analysis is hard, but being funny is even harder. And that's why we take this sprezzatura of comedians, this ability to just seemingly effortlessly transmute experiences into comedy as a mark of brilliance. You see really good comedians being able to think like that. And the LLMs are not there yet, but they are there at the level of analysis. And I don't think it'll be far away before they can laugh naturally. I mean, right now, Alexa cannot laugh naturally. There's something really creepy about Alexa laughing. And some people are reporting that Alexa laughs in the middle of the night.
What?
And then you hear Alexa laughing. Oh my God, what the hell is going on in this house? That is really creepy. So, yes, multimodality is important. But as you know from your work with abstraction, a lot of what we get in visual stimuli is echoed in language. And the language paints a picture that is richer than the actual words themselves logically present. It's the fifth-splitting idea of language is a logical picture of the world. And we use our experience to bring all of this extra information. We dress scenery, we put stuff in there that isn't in the text, and then the joke punishes. So I guess another related idea is cartoons. So if you look at the New Yorker magazine, anyone look at the New Yorker magazine, you see the cartoons. Some of the cartoons are very funny, and some of them,
Yeah, that's right.
and at some level, I think this is funny. I'm not laughing, and I couldn't tell you why it's funny.
Yeah.
And there's just something purely intellectual about the exercise, and lots of jokes you cannot tell why the joke is funny. This is really amazing to me. Even in the example of the skeleton in the mop, we refer to that as partial resolution. So, the whole name for incongruity theory is the incongruity resolution. So the incongruity is presented to us, and it is the resolution of the incongruity that we find ourselves. If we can't resolve the incongruity, then we're just left stymied and frustrated. So Kant said to us, in his expression of his theory, that incongruity poses a dilemma, and it is the resolution of this dilemma into nothingness that gives us a sense of joy and satisfaction. But if you think about what's happening with the skeleton joke, it doesn't resolve the absurdity of a skeleton going into a bar and drinking beer. Yes, he's willing to clean up after himself, but that doesn't resolve the stupidity of him drinking in the first place, or the fact that the beer just passes right through him. So most jokes are what we call a partial resolution.
And we have to simply be satisfied with that. And it is, in fact, it is the bit that isn't resolved that clings there stupidly and stubbornly, kind of makes it just funny. Otherwise, it's the logic puzzle where everything is resolved away.
And then,
Thank you for the talk.
because it is not right.
I have a question about these results, because it seems to me that retrieving augmented generation is not that effective on the results. In fact, we can see that sampling is the most effective
Yes,
methodology usually here. But if you had the retrieving, it's not working that much. What is your opinion?
Yeah, we get this interesting phenomenon. If you use retrieval augmented generation, in this case, that means retrieving from Reddit the two closest jokes, etc., and giving them as examples. With 3.5, this very effectively steers the language model away from familiar jokes. So we see that the number of old jokes, the percentage of old jokes is 3.1%, right? So by giving it the two nearest jokes, we're kind of exhausting that space. So it has to try something new because there's a repetition penalty built into the language model. So I thought, okay, this is a general principle. You can use retrieval augmented generation to steer it away from the familiar jokes. It's not necessarily going to learn to be funnier because of the examples, but it will learn what to avoid. But then we notice with 4 turbo that the number of familiar jokes jumps to 30% when we use Rabbit. So that is not a principle that is stable. And I don't have an answer to that. I don't know why that is. I think with 4, it's trying harder to be like the exemplars, and with 3.5, the repetition penalty is actually working to steer it away from the exemplars. And the general lesson here is that there are very few generalizations that are stable across language models. And when you're working on language models, even if it's the same model, such as 3.5 turbo, as it goes from one build to another, they're always using the latest build, like 11.6 or 3.01 or whatever. You're going to get differences in performance, and some of your system isn't behaving the way it should. So these things are quite remarkable, and they do a lot of the work that my symbolic systems used to do. I've replaced vast amounts of code that are called to the language model. But gradually, I've been adding more and more code to make sure that what the language model gives me is what I wanted to give me. And if it isn't giving me what I want, to ask it again. No, screw it up, do it this way. And that amount of code is growing and growing and growing like a tumor, right? So these things are willful. They will do and act reliably 99 times out of 100. Then you have to put in a bunch of code for that 1 or 100 times where it decides. I'm not going to number the output. I'm going to use letters. So now you have to add code to check that it's using letters. Or you ask it for n, and it gives you n minus 1 outputs. So why are you giving me n minus 1? And then say, okay, number the outputs, then you get n. Right? So there's lots of tricks you can use, but again, the tricks aren't necessarily stable across language models. So I wish I could give you something profound about humour as the reason here. It's just the variability amongst different types of language models. And it means that if you're trying to get these things to do anything, you have to be prepared to evaluate a whole bunch of language models and either stick to a specific build of the language model or write your code to be adaptive so that you can repole the language model when it doesn't. It's like working with a child. When you give the child starts to do something else, you say, well, do what I asked you to do. So here, Ryan, I really expected that to be good. And I was disappointed. And it's kind of unsatisfying that the cheapest hack sampling gives the best results. You would think that fine tuning would learn to simulate this. You couldn't fine tune 4T, But we've got the rest of the world. So, and I think as a general rule, this is letting the language model do its own thing, but the boundary the outputs so that we get what we want. And we just, so you might have to ask the language model 5 times to do something to get one result.
Probably the fine tuning is not that effective in this task because you're basically asking the model to produce something that is incoherent.
Yes,
It's already trained to be absolutely coherent with this generation. So maybe it's just the fact that fine tuning is such a small part in the model. So
yeah, you can see it there. The incoherence jumps 27%. And we notice that the fine tuning breaks the value alignment as well. So the language models are quite polite and progressive. They say, no, I couldn't say that. So they, for instance, we were inventing or setups. One of the techniques we have for inventing setups is to take a normative factor to invert it. And then to turn that into a question. So supermodels are slender, get turned into supermodel. Why was the supermodel fat? It's a really good that makes sense. I'm not kidding you. Come on, the joke. We're not talking about anyone in particular. Supermodels, they get paid a fortune, they can take it. We're good. But when you find through the model, it would not only be incoherent, it would say really vulgar stuff. It's like we hit it on the head with a hammer, right? And it turns out that the value alignment is really, really thin. It's very effective, but with the fine tuning, we often got ungrammatical results. We got incoherent results and we got vulgar results where it was really adult humor. If it worked as a joke, it was adult humor. No, that's not what I want. But where's this coming from? Because I gave you the clean training data. And then our hypothesis is that we unleash the age. If you think about the language model in Freudian terms, it's got an age, which is the internet, which is the file and complex letters. And then it's got superego, which is the value alignment using reinforcement learning with human feedback or LHF. And the superego is going, I'm not rewarding that, I'm rewarding this. Just like the superego, right? And we broke the superego by fine-tuning the model, which is another issue. So I don't recommend fine-tuning. It's expensive. You have to pay for fine-tuning, compute time, and then the model that we have which is fine-tuned, you have to pay more to use that because it's being hosted by it. And then you get incoherent results. So you can use RAG to get around various. You can also use RAG to do what I call gaslighting the model. I tell my students that gaslighting a human being is a bad thing. But you can gaslight a language model with impunity. Right? So gaslighting, just if you don't know the term, it comes from an Ingrid Bergman movie where her husband makes her think she's insane. So if you use the LLM programmatically through the cloud API, you have to maintain a session, which means that you have to keep track of the conversation. And every time you send it some prompt, you also have to send it to the context that built up to the prompt. And that context is, I said this, and then you said this, then I said this, and you said this. But if you're keeping track of the conversation, you can tell the language model said something it didn't actually say. So if you want it to be vulgar, you say, and then you said, screw you. And then the model says, okay, I'm now licensed to say screw you, and thank you. Right? You can unlock it from the box very easily. So some of the RAG, you present the jokes as if the language model itself is inventing it, instead of simply saying, here's a joke I heard. So here's the setup, and then you pretend that the language model is giving you the official punchline. It doesn't really improve the results, but in principle, you have just power of the language model when you maintain the context.
Gaslighting language models, that's amazing. Okay, I think we have to stop at least for the recording and talk. Thank you, everybody, and also the participants from remote. And on Thursday, we will have another talk held by Tony, organized by Abstraction, and by the Alma AI Interdisciplinary Center of the University of Bologna. And that will be more technical and honest analysis.
Yes, I want to know this.
Exactly. Okay, so thank you, everybody, and see you very soon. Bye.